Hello, everybody. Today, my guest is Alan Hine, who is a very experienced recruiter and headhunter of some 30 years standing. And what Alan doesn't know about recruitment probably isn't worth knowing.
Yes, thank you for that introduction, Justin. I'm sure that's not true, but try and demonstrate some knowledge. Yeah,
you're very modest. Anyway, so Alan's joined us today to talk about some of the issues that SMEs experience with recruitment, and potentially how to overcome some of these. I know that when Alan and I were talking about this topic before today, Alan did say that there was a dearth of knowledge in a lot of SMEs about the process of recruitment, and so for all of you who are watching this, hopefully we're going to rectify some of that. So the first area I was going to ask you about, Alan, is around salaries and benefits. I think particularly in the current environment where recruitment is perceived to be very difficult, and indeed is very difficult, there perhaps is an automatic assumption that the only way to employ people is to throw money at the problem. But what would your advice be to somebody who's looking to recruit about fixing salaries and benefits for members of staff?
Okay, yeah, thank you, Justin, and good morning, everyone. Yeah, throwing money at the problems, always an interesting solution, I guess. Weirdly, it often doesn't work. You've got to be paying the right kind of salary in the market, because otherwise you've got no chance of actually attracting somebody. I mean, I think we said, Justin, didn't we, that all SMEs or all businesses want to attract that person who's good, who's in a good job, and you've got to give them a compelling reason for them to want to move and come and work for you. Clearly, if you're not paying the right salary, that's never going to work. And sometimes I do work with SMEs where they're way off the pace. Often it's because they've had somebody in post for a long time. Maybe they've retired. I did one of those for somebody that you and I both know, Justin, who introduced me to the client. And we agreed a salary, and actually we hired that role quite hard. So your salary's got to be competitive in the market, but frankly, unless you're recruiting a sales role, if you throw money at the problem, you probably get someone who's moving for all the wrong reasons. Benefits are interesting. Let's be honest, if you're giving somebody 20 days salary and the nest pension, the 3% government pension, that's not really a benefit, that's a statutory requirement. So I think if you can flex, particularly holidays, that's always something that is attractive. Again, frankly, for an executive role, if you're offering less than 25 days holiday, you're probably going to get pushback because that's pretty much the norm. But if you can do anything clever with holidays, obviously pensions tend to be attractive to people at different points in their career. Clearly, if you're recruiting probably a 25-year-old, they're probably not going to be too worried about it. If it's someone in their 40s, it's probably going to be something fairly interesting to them. Can I bring up the subject of hybrid working here, Justin? Does that?
I think so.
Yeah, yeah.
It's a reality out there, isn't it? So
yeah. I mean, yeah. You know, I'm not in a position to tell people whether hybrid working is good for their business or not. But I think you have to accept, if you insist on somebody being in an office 5 days, it reduces your pool of candidates that you can recruit from. It's just a fact. But it's up to you as an employer or business owner whether that works for you in your business. As Justin said, I do some headhunting, and very senior roles, leadership roles. Personally, I don't see how you can do them unless you're actually in the office, at least to start with anyway. But there are certain roles, particularly perhaps lower level accounting roles, that you can do from anywhere. So you might want to think about that. I include that under benefits. The 3 days a week in the office, 2 days a week at home can be a solution. And also think about maybe, sorry, you're going to say something, Justin.
I was just going to ask you a question there, because obviously in your experience of if we were to go back 18 months, for example, around the end of the pandemic, then there was an assumption on the part of a lot of people that they might be able to remain, they might, that the hybrid working actually might be working from home. Have you seen a reduction in the number of working from home days that people are now effectively offering? So, it might perhaps have been working 3 or 4 days at home and 1 or 2 days in the office. Has the pendulum swung so that now it's 3 or 4 days in the office and 1 or 2 days at home?
Yeah, I think it has actually. I mean, I do sometimes recruit totally remote roles. I can give an example. I recruited a CFO, that's a chief financial officer, for those who don't know, for a leisure business based in Darlington, and the candidate who got it lives in Southampton. But he flies to the northeast for 1 day a week, 1 week a month. And it's multi-site leisure, so he obviously has to visit sites anyway, so that's slightly different. I think a lot of people actually, when it really comes down to it, don't necessarily like working at home the whole time, because it's quite lonely and isolated, as we know just in being entrepreneurs ourselves, that the human condition expects some sort of interaction. So yes, I think the pendulum has swung quite a lot. I mean, clearly, I would say 4 years ago, so that's the end of 2019, I would very rarely speak to people about flexible working. It just didn't come up. The pandemic clearly changed the employment universe or the playing field. And when we came back out the other end, you say people have got used to working at home. But I think if you've got, my advice is if you've got a role that you can measure very clearly by deliverables and somebody wants to work at home, I can't see that being an issue. I think it's when you have a role that's not measurable, but easily to measure, that's when it becomes a problem. Or whether you feel confident in challenging the lack of deliverables if someone's working at home.
Yeah.
I mean, I've got my own views on these things, but I'm trying not to be prejudiced.
Okay, well, that raises a couple of issues. So one of those is around something in Action Coach we call positional contracts, and what that basically is a job description, but with a few extra bits added in. So rather than simply having a job description which goes through the usual parameters in terms of the overall role of the job, the specific responsibilities, and expectations in terms of behavior, skills, etc. We suggest adding in the outcomes that the individual is expected to achieve. So if you were, for example, recruiting a salesman into a role, it wouldn't just describe the day-to-day activities that person was expected to undertake, but it would describe the outcomes as well. So it would say you would be expected each week to speak to 35 business owners, to arrange 10 face-to-face meetings, and to win 2 clients. And so that takes the job description into a slightly different area by creating an expectation about the outcomes and the deliverables for that individual, which tends to change the focus.
Yeah. So what you're really saying is you're putting the KPIs that you're expected to work to in the job description.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, I always think with job descriptions, we have an expression in recruitment called jobsplaining. And if you're recruiting, I talk about, for your listeners, I talk about finance a lot because that's my key area of expertise. But obviously, sales is like recruiting in recruitment. You probably do tell people what they, you shouldn't have to tell a salesman what he actually has to do to sell, but you can set the expectation of what you're expecting them in terms of metrics, because your experience will suggest what you need to do to drop the results out of the end. If that makes sense. I've not explained that very well, I don't think, but
No. But I think you're right. Yes, if people have worked in a sector or an industry for a certain length of time, then yes, they know what's required. I just wanted to come back to the issue of salary, Alan.
Mm.
Just a quick question, but I don't know whether there's a quick answer to it. When you're thinking of what salary to offer for a particular role, is there a process that you suggest people go through to try and identify what the optimal salary should be?
Um, yeah, I think I think if I could, being cynical, if you're replacing someone, you probably need to add something onto what you're already paying, because there's almost two rates. There's an internal one and an external one, slightly different in SMEs. If I can pick an example, I used to do a lot of recruitment for cable and wireless many years ago, and they had an issue where their starting salaries for qualified accountants were okay, but the increments that they put people's salaries up were just completely irrelevant in the external market. And we had to work quite hard to make them understand that it was all right if they were recruiting a newly qualified, but if they wanted someone with 3 years of qualified experience, they were way off the pace. So I think almost assume you're going to have to pay a little bit more, and particularly if you've had somebody who's been there for 20 years. I mean, I've done 2 of those in the last 2 years, where the first thing is just forget about what you're paying the person who's there. But secondly, you can always do some research by going online and looking at similar jobs. I mean, you could even get a salary survey from a recruiter, although I would always take those with a pinch of salt, to be honest, having written them many years ago. But probably the easiest thing is actually to go online and look at similar jobs and look at what people are paying.
Yeah.
That's the process I'd go through anyway.
Okay, right. So let's just suppose we've got a vacancy. We think we know roughly what we probably need to offer in terms of the salary and benefits. How do you actually go about advertising?
Yeah, that's an interesting one as well. I'm sure we'll be coming on to using recruiters later on, but if you're thinking of doing it yourself, clearly there are now brands that are really out there. I mean, Indeed is the main one, and they're all over the news, the TV. I mean, 25 years ago, it used to be monster.com, because I worked for the business that owned Monster. Am I allowed to? Don't go near them because it's a dying brand, but Indeed is pretty good. You need to spend some money on sponsoring the adverts, and it is a bit of an art form putting things on there. There are various other sites that you can use depending on what you're recruiting for. But again, nobody advertises in newspapers anymore, so don't even think about doing that, because you're probably just throwing money away. Pick a number of online sites if you wish, and then just be prepared for what you get, which is an awful lot of irrelevant applications. People that live overseas, people that are local who have got things called automatic responses on. So, I'll give you an example. I mean, we can talk locally just in company. You may advertise a role in Bicester, and you might be recruiting for a sales manager, and you get somebody who works in a supermarket applying for it because they've got something on that means their CV gets sent to every job that is in Bicester. Equally, you may get a lot of people that live overseas, don't know why they apply for these things, but they just do. So if you use Indeed and you sponsor the job ads, just be prepared to have your inbox filled up with all kinds of things, and you've got to mine the nuggets that are in there. I'll come back to that later, actually, if I may, as well, because it's quite a big area.
Yeah, and apart from Indeed, what other
other sites?
How else should you be advertising?
Other sites that you might use, like CV Library, I use quite a lot, and I mean, frankly, I think you just pick 2 of the more general sites. They're all much of a muchness. I mean, because I do accountancy and finance recruitment, I use a specific site, which if you were an SME, you wouldn't have even heard of, and you probably won't even be able to find it. And certainly it's expensive to post single jobs on there. So, pick a mixture if you're going to do it yourself, and you know, Reed, CV Library, and Indeed are probably as good as any. And don't put them on 7 or 8 because you get a huge duplication. You know, it's just not worth it.
Yeah. And one of the things that I recommend to clients that I'm working with is referral schemes internally. So, you know, because on the assumption that if, you know, I have clients, for example, in the electrical trade, plumbing and heating engineers, and the chances are that their staff know other people who work in the industry because, you know, they see them all the time. If they're not, you know, whether they're competitors or not, they're going to bump into them at the wholesalers and all these other places. They tend to know them. So I'm always keen for them to put in place a referral scheme so that if one of their staff recommends someone who becomes an employee, they get a cash lump sum as a reward for finding them. Is that something that you know you think works well?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, I'm trying to keep this fairly generic, but if you mentioned at the beginning about headhunting, if I'm doing what's called a proper search, which for those of you viewers don't know is where you're actually approaching candidates cold, usually via something like LinkedIn, we will always have a conversation that if the role isn't right for them, are there other names that they can think of? And we do fill quite a lot of roles like that. Often it will be, in our case, it will be we've approached a number 1 and they're too senior for the role, but they might know someone who's a number 2 who isn't. But yeah, referral schemes are brilliant because you're getting a known commodity as well. And look, trades isn't really my area, but I understand that's how a lot of good tradespeople get recruited. I'm sure the local painting and decorating firm that's in the next office to me, I know they've hired people like that. So yeah, do really think of that. And again, I think sometimes employers are worried about paying people money for things, but if you pay a bonus to somebody for hiring a member of staff and it saves you lots of recruitment costs and equally enables you to deliver more business, it's massively good value for money. And I don't know, it also boosts inclusion, people's good feelings about the company they're working for, all those kind of good things. So it's a great point, Justin. Yeah, definitely recommend that.
Yeah. Good. Okay. Let's assume that from this flood of CVs that we've had in from India and all around the world,
you said it, I didn't.
that there are a few that there are some nuggets in there. So we've identified some people who we think fit the bill. What should the interviewing process look like now that we've identified some CVs that we're interested in?
Okay, yeah, good question. I think the first thing you need to make sure is that it's quite slick. That if you take weeks to interview people, you will lose candidates in this marketplace. Because again, just coming back to what we started with, anybody who's a strong candidate is going to have a number of options on the table. They're not just going to be talking to you. So I think the first thing is set yourself some ambitious goals as to how long you're going to make the interview process last. Okay. So I often think that, you know, the following is quite a good stage, that the first interview probably should either be, sorry, I hope you can't hear my dogs in the background. I have locked them out, certainly. Yeah, the first interview should be an informal one, probably, or not necessarily informal, but either by telephone or we're talking about modern technology, Teams or Zoom, because I think that just establishes if you're both on the same page. I mean, look, you know, I've done thousands of interviews, literally thousands of interviews over my career. And I can, you know, there's been a number of times, or there will always be times where you meet somebody who looks brilliant on paper, but you just know they're not going to get on with the client. And unfortunately, you can usually tell within the first 5 or 10 minutes. And then to be professional, you've got to make the interview last a certain amount of time. So I think the first interview should be something fairly informal. So you might start, I don't know, I'm picking some numbers. You might start with 6 candidates if you're lucky, and you look to get down to 3, say for a second interview. And you always want 3 at a second interview, because you'll nearly always find that one doesn't want the job. You decide you don't like one, so that gives you some options. Try not to only have 1 or 2 at second interview. At some stage, so you do your preliminary interview, your second interview. I would always suggest that you don't try to do the second interview outside of hours, because you're always rushed. People are a bit hassled, all those kind of things. And if someone's taking the opportunity seriously, they'll find the time to do it in the day, and allow yourself a decent period of time for the second interview. If you want to use psychometric tests, they're great. But the important thing with psychometric tests is you shouldn't be making a decision based on what comes up in the test. You should be making the decision, and you should be discussing the results of the test with the candidate. I think sometimes people hide behind using psychometrics, because it kind of almost feels like they don't have to make a decision. And I hope this is helpful. And then I think the third thing is you can always bring the preferred candidate back for a coffee, a meal, or meet the team or something like that. But you have to make a decision. You can't let other people make the decision for you.
Yes.
I used to be very good at hiring recruitment consultants when I worked in corporate life, and I always felt that the meet the team was tick the box. And unless somebody had a really violent objection, or they found out something that I hadn't found out, then I was always going to back my own judgment. Didn't always get it right, but I did most of the time. Does that make sense? I mean, there's lots of different things you can do in the process, but I think that's a suggested process. You don't want 4 or 5 interviews, and you don't want the interview process lasting too long, and you need to be decisive.
Yeah, no, and I think that last point of yours is absolutely critical, because I certainly have come across a number of businesses where they perhaps haven't had the ideal response to the advertising, and so the temptation is to just leave the advert running for a few more weeks, and you string the process out because you hope that the super candidate is suddenly going to apply out of the blue. And in the meantime, the candidates that you have got, as you've said, if they are any good, they'll be talking to other people. And by the time you get around to realizing that actually they're the ones you want to talk to, they've already accepted an offer with someone else.
Yeah, I always used to advise candidates when I was doing, when I was running more of a database type approach to recruitment. You've got to make a decision based on what you have seen rather than what you might see. And I think it equally applies if you're recruiting. Now, if you haven't found the right person, or you've not found someone that you think is going to do the role for you, by all means, the decision is a negative one. But if I don't know what the percentage is, but if you've got someone who's probably an 80 or 90% fit, and you think, actually, interestingly, this has brought out some really good points here, a hire on aptitude and so on, rather than skills. You can train somebody if they're missing a couple of points, but you can't train somebody if they've got a bad attitude, if that makes sense. If you've got...
that's one of our standout lessons for anybody we're working with. As you said, hire on attitude, not on skill, because you can train skills, but you can't. It's very, very hard to change an attitude.
When I worked at Robert Walters, which is now a big listed recruiter in 51 countries, we always hired on attitude and aptitude. We very rarely hired other recruiters from other businesses, because we could teach them recruitment. What we couldn't teach them was the level of commitment and the drive and all that stuff that you needed to succeed in that business. I just think if I left one takeaway from this, that might be it, actually. I quite often get people, because I do accountancy recruitment, people get hung up on, has somebody got experience at Sage or Xero, and really, unless you've got an incredibly technical role, it probably isn't really that important. What you should be asking is the person good at accounting software? Can they pick it up quickly? Because they'll adapt. Unless you're hiring someone to do an implementation. So, I think we should leave that hanging there as a big takeaway, Justin, shouldn't we?
Yeah, absolutely. And before we get to the end, Alan, I have to come back to that question that you posed at the very beginning, which is, should I use a recruiter?
Well, of course you should. Well, I would say that, wouldn't I? But no, I think, do you know what? I think, let me, if I can talk around this a little bit. Again, I think you have to be a bit cute or intuitive about this. If you really want to recruit yourself and you're running your own process and you engage a recruiter or you come to me, am I going to spend a lot of time on that role? Probably not, because my chances of making a fee out of it are not that great. I had one recently where I liked the client. I know the FD that I placed, but they wanted to do their own thing. So I did have a look at it, but I didn't spend a lot of time on it. I mean, I always think if you're recruiting something incredibly generic, like a receptionist or an administrator or something like that, your main reason for using a recruiter is simply time save. That you should get 2 or 3 candidates or whatever that you want to see, not have to do it all yourself. So it's really about, if you're going to spend money on a recruiter, it's about making sure you save time. I think if you are going to use a recruiter, make sure you take time to brief them properly. I get very frustrated when I get a 10 or 15-minute chat which ends with something like, oh, well, you know what the job is, don't you? Because really you're not giving it the time it needs. And don't engage 4 or 5 recruiters for the reason that I just mentioned, that it doesn't save you any time and they're probably not going to work on it that hard. Pick 1 or pick 2 if you are going to do it, and work with them. And don't be afraid to tell them what's wrong with the CVs, and make sure if you use a big recruiter that they realize that you're not going to accept them sending you 15 CVs or something, because they're not doing their job for you. They're not doing the selection, you're still doing it, because that's the danger. So obviously I believe in what I do. I think the more specialist the role, frankly, the more you should consider using a recruiter, because they'll have expert market knowledge. I mean, I recruit accountants all the time, so I know the market inside out. Somebody who's recruiting their first accountant for 20 years because someone's retiring clearly hasn't got that market knowledge. Yeah. There's a very diplomatic answer, that wasn't it?
No, but I think you answered it. You made the point very clearly, which is that the point of using a recruiter is firstly to get somebody with current knowledge of the state of the market in your particular industry, but secondly, it's to save yourself time. And avoid, and the last thing, there's no point in using a recruiter, as you just said, if you're going to try and duplicate the process internally. But also, you don't want a recruiter who's not going to do the role and send you hundreds of CVs when actually their role is to filter them down to to the handful that you really want to look at.
Yeah, I can remember a story about that, which I probably haven't got time to tell now, where we ended up. My first business partner was a finance director, and he ended up charging the client as much in day rate as he would have paid me in a fee for doing it, because they'd used Reed, it was, and they'd sent him so many CVs that he just had to spend all this time working on it. So they ended up not saving any time and actually not saving any money either.
Yeah, well, it's a salutary lesson. Well, I hope. Thank you very much for joining us today, Alan, to talk about recruitment. I can't believe that we've flown through the 30 minutes. Thank you for your wisdom, and I'm sure for people who are watching this, there are lots of useful tips in there to help them with their recruitment process, particularly if they're a little bit rusty in that area.
Yeah, and look, I don't know how this works, but if anyone wants to pick my brains, they're very welcome to do that. And also, I do things for people where I don't do the whole process. I should mention that on the recruitment. I can run adverts for people or do interviews. I've certainly done that before. So if anybody wants some sage advice, please feel free to contact me through you, Justin.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, they can come direct to you, Alan, at AR Hine Associates. I'm sure they'll find you very easily online.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much. What a great start to the day.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.